It's very normal to think that you're weird or different because you are weird and you are different. But so is everyone else. We are all weird and wonderfully different. But since you are listening to this show, it's safe to assume that you are more different than most, aren't you? Prone to the spooky, the gothic, the unusual, the frightening. Perhaps obsessed with the dark side, or maybe it just gives you a ghoulish little thrill. In any event, this is an episode just for you. 3 dark tales, and perhaps one more, particularly gruesome, but only when I'm sure all the adults are gone. I call them bedtime stories for children of questionable character. Drinking whiskey in the kitchen and telling scary stories around the fire. Music, monsters, and mayhem. Killers, cannibals, and cults. Fearful fiction and furious fact. Tall tales and terrifying truths. This is a scary home companion. Little Timmy was up before first light. When his parents and his older siblings woke up, he was already sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling out a treasure map in colored pencil. "Someone is ready for a trip to the beach," his dad said. They packed the car and set out. On the drive, Timmy showed his mother the map he had drawn. "The dream woman said she would leave me buried treasure at the beach, and this is how I find it." Timmy had brought his plastic bucket and had nicked the garden trowel from the shed because the plastic shovel was far too flimsy for such an important job. When they arrived at the white sands of the shoreline, they all went their own ways, while staying within sight of one another. Timmy studied the map. His sister laid out to sunbathe. His brother grabbed the boogie board and hit the surf. And his parents set up umbrellas, opened up drinks, and proceeded to hide from the sun. Timmy walked down the beach. He compared the sand dunes to the ones on his map. "Don't go too far, Timmy," his dad called. He didn't need to go much further. He was close to the right spot. He tucked the map into the mesh pocket of his swim trunks, and he walked over to what looked like a little lump in the wet sand. It turns out he didn't need the garden trowel or the bucket. He pulled sand away with his bare hands and revealed a heavy glass jar. He struggled to wrench it free of the beach's firm grasp. The glass of the jar was so thick he could barely see through it, but it appeared to be empty, except for some black gunk just inside the lid. Timmy sat down cross-legged, squeezing the base of the jar between his thighs, and he huffed and puffed and pulled on that lid. He twisted, he turned. He thought about finding a rock to just smash it open. But then, finally, there was a soft hiss as the seal cracked and air flooded into the old jar. Timmy lifted the lid and looked at the black goop that coated the inside of it. When the rays of the sun hit it, it sparkled a dazzling green. Then the gunk moved. It sort of squishy slurmed together into a tubular shape like a slug. He'd never seen anything like it before, and so he grabbed it. "Timmy," his mom said. She walked up the beach towards him. His back was to her, so she couldn't see what was happening, but he was quaking and shaking his head back and forth. "Timmy," she asked. She touched his shoulder, but he was still now. She saw he was holding an old empty glass jar. The lid was in the sand next to him. "What's this, Timmy?" He was silent. He looked up at her, blinking rapidly. And for some reason, in the rays of the sun, his hazel eyes shimmered green. "Mom, I'm hungry." "Well, come on, let's get you some watermelon slices." She took Timmy by the hand and pulled him up, and he licked his lips. In the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, the state of Florida was wild and lawless. The land itself was brutal, unforgiving, as deadly as it was beautiful. And much of the land had been long in dispute and the source of bloodshed and violence between the U.S. military and the native tribes. Being such a dangerous place, Florida was also the perfect place to hide, to make a fresh start. If you could dig in down here, no one could ever root you out without an army. In a quiet little patch of woods, not too far from the Edmund Gaines settlement, was a trading outpost called Oxlawatchie. It was little more than a cluster of buildings, a few boarding rooms, a general store, and a saloon. And it was the saloon that made this place special. The drinks were strong, and the gambling tables were always full of action. This was a pretty quiet stretch of Florida backwoods, and for 2 days' ride in any direction, this was the only spot to find real gambling. It wasn't uncommon for the saloon to get strangers coming through, either by chance or by following the reputation for cards and dice that this place was building for itself. But on this dark and stormy night, the stranger that walked into the saloon was the strangest they had ever seen. The whole room went dead silent as the man strolled in fearlessly. He took off his long white trench coat, shaking off the raindrops and hanging it on a hook by the door. The wide brim of his white cowboy hat had kept the rain from putting out his cigarette that dangled from the corner of his mouth. The man was 7 feet tall, long and lanky, dressed in white from the stiletto tips of his alligator skin boots to the leather tassels on his shoulders. His skin was pale white, devoid of pigment, and his long white hair cascaded down his back in a river of relaxed curls. The room stared at him, and he calmly appraised them with his bright pink eyes. I'm the world's tallest albino. Maybe you heard of me. I'm here to play cards. One of the dealers stood up. Aaron? Aaron? You're gonna want to see this, boss. Out of the back room strode another very tall and very pale man. When he saw the stranger, he stopped short. Standing in the doorway, framed under the giant banner that read, "Home of the world's tallest albino." The stranger shouted, "You no good son of a dog! You sold me to that freak show, you stole my money, and you took my identity? I should have killed you when I had the chance." "Calm down, Arlo," said Aaron. At 6'10.5" Aaron was still very, very tall. It was only when the brothers were in the same room together that the lie became obvious. "Calm down, or else what?" Arlo asked. He touched the pearl handle of the revolver in his belt. And then he heard the clickety-clacks of guns and bullets all around him. Aaron said, "Because some of these men are my friends, some are my employees, some of them just like my dice, but ain't no one in this room wants anything to happen to the saloon. Right, boys?" The boys agreed. "So why don't you just keep moving, baby brother?" Aaron chided him. "I read the papers about what happened to that freak show. There's some pretty crazy stories. That P.T. Barnum Museum burning down, I suspect that was your people done that?" Arlo kept his hand on his gun. "You know, this is the gun I swore to kill you with, Aaron. Instead, I propose we play cards. I'll wager this gun and what it represents. You win, you get the gun, and I leave in peace forever. I win, I get this saloon." Aaron laughed. The boys laughed. "You got some set on you, I'll give you that. But you got no leverage. I don't need to play cards with you. I don't need to do anything. What's to stop me from shooting you down right now?" "Well, you read the stories, so you heard about that so-called freak army that the Coyote Princess raised after burning down all those circuses? I bet you think that's a lot of big city hogwash. Well, study on this." He put his fingers into his mouth and he war-whistled. And immediately a response came from outside. Whistles and whoops, shouts and calls, grunts and squawks that sounded like wounded birds. A cacophony of voices, both human and otherwise, all responding to his call. Dozens of them surrounding the entire building. "You got friends? I got friends," Arlo chided his brother. "No reason for a dust-up. That would probably leave this whole place a ruin. Why don't we just sit down and play cards?" So the two men, the two brothers, the two tallest albinos in the world, sat down on either side of a table, inside a ring of armed Florida crackers, inside an even bigger ring of Lord only knows out in the brush, under a single overhead light, with only a deck of cards and 13 years of bad blood between them. They played one hand. Draw poker is the house game, Aaron said. Arlo laughed. You never graduated past the Rube games, did you? Aaron shuffled. Arlo cut the deck. Aaron dealt. Arlo laid his gun on the table. Aaron looked at his cards. Arlo did not. Aaron traded 2 and drew 2 fresh cards. Arlo didn't even touch his hand. You know the difference between us, Aaron? Arlo dumped the bullets from his gun, and they scattered across the green felt of the table. You're a draw man, and me, I'm a stud. He flipped over his cards. And he still didn't look down at them. He preferred to watch his brother's eyes as Aaron looked at the cards. Aaron was defeated, crestfallen, angry, all at once. That was the sweetest victory scrawled out across his no-good brother's face, and he didn't want to miss a nanosecond. From that point on, the saloon became the property of the world's tallest albino. The genuine article this time. The outpost of Oxlawachi prospered and grew into a small town as the Coyote Princess and her army settled down to raise families. And it's still there, hidden in the heart of Florida, to this very day. Many of my stories start rather happily, before slowly turning dark and frightening. This is a very different kind of story. One with a dark and frightening start that goes somewhere much brighter. This is the story of a baby named Erath. In the history of children with troubled childhoods, Erath might have been more troubled than all of them combined. First, there was the scare with the midwife when Erath got his little neck tangled up in the cords and cables on his way out. Then, a few months later, he got terribly sick with a double ear infection. Last, but certainly not least, on his way back from a hospital trip, Erath's car got attacked by a psychotic, mutilated serial killer who slaughtered both of his parents. The monster was a post-human abomination called Razormouth, who had just escaped the local insane asylum. But Razormouth did not eat Erath. Instead, he took the wee child with him into the woods. And for a number of months, the two of them lived like wild animals, killing for food and shelter along the way as the monster cared for the baby and raised it as its own. Eventually, the authorities caught them. The monster was whisked away deep under the earth. And after a few months of careful study and examination, the baby was put into protective custody. That was a long time ago. Erath was now 4 years old. That protective custody had turned into a long stay at several government facilities, which eventually had led to a friendly foster home. Erath had barely been 1 when he lived like a monster, and now he was more civilized than any of his handlers, any of the researchers or doctors or scientists had predicted. Erath was comfortable wearing clothes and shoes. His hygiene had come a long way. He could even sit at a table to eat, instead of dragging his food underneath and devouring it like a ravenous beast. His foster parents slowly, delicately started to re-socialize him, even letting him interact with other children under certain conditions and very, very heavy supervision. Erath was still easily triggered, and at the slightest emotional provocation, he could revert to his primitive, feral state. This was, after all, a boy who spent several of his most formative months watching people get murdered and subsisting off of their flesh and blood. That he wasn't completely normal was expected. That Erath had come so far so quickly, that was not. One day, Erath was in the front room of his house, playing with matchbox cars on the floor. His foster father was flipping through the cable channels, looking for something to watch, and quickly, ever so briefly, gone so fast it was hardly even there, Erath saw a flash of news footage. A still shot. A monster. His forked tongue poking out between razor blade teeth. His short fingers tipped with bone needles. The monster was stooped down, his flesh a vascular roadmap of scars. Erath stood up. He dropped his matchbox cars. Dad?
Are you wasting your life, son? Are you wasting your life, son? Are you wasting your life, son? Are you wasting your life, son?
Okay. Are we cool? Are all the adults gone? Because I got one more for you, but it's distasteful, doesn't quite cover it. But now that it's just us, I wanted to get something off my chest. A story, an experience that I've never said out loud before. Honest. I've never been able to bring myself to recount it in any detail. Do you know what that's like? This is the reason that Thanksgiving still weirds me out a little bit, and it's definitely the reason I can never even think about eating cranberries ever again without getting physically ill. Or cherries, because they're so similar in appearance and texture to cranberries. For a few years, even grapes were off the table. You'll understand. This happened on a Thanksgiving 15, maybe even 16 years ago. Way back in the day. And I was hosting Thanksgiving at my apartment that year. Family and friends were all crowded around the little table. We had food up to here, laughs, anecdotes, some cringe moments, Everything that you expect from a holiday get-together. There were so many people there, in and out, that I really have no idea who it was that slipped away to use the restroom right before I did. I've thought about it 1,000 times, and there's no one likely culprit. It could have been anyone, because... Sorry, it's taken me a minute. It's still so vivid. Okay, so I go into the bathroom and I raise the lid of the commode to urinate. And that's when I saw it. Floating there. Swimming laps. Staring up at me, very literally. It was a turd of substantial size, but that wasn't the disturbing part. There was also a cranberry embedded in the side of this floater. A full, complete, juicy, and undamaged cranberry. And it watched me with an unblinking eye. Just the sight of it. The implication that it carried. Who had swallowed an entire cranberry without chewing? How had it survived a wash of stomach acid and a perilous journey through several dozen feet worth of intestine and remained as round and firm with unblemished rosy red skin as when it was on the table in the dish? I flushed. I couldn't even pee, mind you. I was too disturbed. I couldn't look down and pee with that thing looking up at me. I needed to get rid of the monstrosity and then go. And so I flushed. And that just made it swim faster, so I flushed again to no avail. The buoyancy of this turd, perhaps even because of the cranberry, was stronger than the pull of the flush. Finally, I unrolled a fistful of toilet paper. I threw it on top of the turd just to cover it up, like covering up a dead body. And then I flushed again. I went out to the backyard to pee and reset, clear my head, so I could get back to having family fun times. And the rest of the afternoon was family fun times. I ate too much turkey and too many potatoes and too much stuffing and way too much gravy. Not to mention the beers and I think a few whiskeys. So the whole day is a nice, comfortable blur in general. Later on in the evening, I hesitantly approached the toilet again. No one had said a word about anything the whole day, so I assumed the problem was gone. Still, I bit my lip a little bit when I opened that lid. On the plus side, it was gone. All the flushes throughout the day, I guess, had softened up this buoyant turd and broken it and carried it away. But, as inexplicable as this may sound, the cranberry was still there, floating, round and smooth and red, as if it had not been consumed, digested, and excreted once already. Just floating. And that's when I threw up. There you go. I've experienced a lot of weird, crazy, scary, and disgusting things in my life. But the most ghoulish and gruesome of all was that Cranberry. Thank you for listening to another episode of A Scary Home Companion. This is the kickoff for Season 9. And if you aren't caught up, you weirdos should go listen to the previous installments. Bedtime Stories for Weird Kids, Bedtime Stories for Weird Adults, Bedtime Stories for Creepy Children, Christmas Stories for Weird Kids, Halloween Stories for Weird Kids, and Death Poetry Jam. Bedtime Poems for Weird Kids. You can find the show on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or contact us directly at ascaryhomecompanion@gmail.com. You could just cut to the chase and go visit the Patreon page. Although you just listened to episode 101 of the official show, there are 4.5 exclusive episodes only on Patreon, along with background material, stories, a complete timeline of show events, and insightful post-mortem analysis videos. Probably some other stuff too. This episode was edited and produced by Big Daddy Jeff Davidson, who also might have contributed a little voice work. Featured music by Act, In Bed So Good, Komiku with Beach, Guitar Wizards of the Future with My Brothers, Ulises Lima with Dad and Son, Gerbil Church with Cranberry Kiss Killer, Lobo Loco with More Starsky, More Hutch, and Chelsea Oxendine with the new theme music. And here's something else new we're trying out, ending each episode with a trailer for the next episode. Enjoy.
In the aftermath of a deadly attack, two mismatched cops uncover a sinister conspiracy. A cult of serial killers is planning mayhem and murder on the streets of Magic City. And these cops are all that stand between the Sunshine State becoming the Bloodshed State. Prepare yourself for the horrors of Miami Slice. Coming soon to A Scary Home Companion.